for questions. You make a brief introduction about the general
situation.
Huh?
So I'll do the
Why you lost? And I'll do the so now what?
right, and then we'll come back and
Then we'll come back and take it from there.
Okay.
Okay.
So you and me, as good friends, we are going to share this mic.
Okay. Yeah. No problem.
Welcome, everybody. And thanks for coming. First, we'd like to thank the Director of Encuentros Complutenses, José Manuel García Vázquez, who has been pushing to put this event forward. Our Vice Rector for Research, Ignacio Lizasoain, and our Vice Rector for International Affairs, members of the Academic Council that managed to put together these many meetings we have today. We started early here this morning, and we are going to finish also in this beautiful classic Complutense room. As you might heard, there's a new president-elect in the United States. 1 year ago, everybody said that when 1.5 years ago, everybody said that Trump wasn't presidential to win the primary election in the Conservative Party, Republican Party in the United States. And then in the beginning, he was kind of fighting with Dr. Carlson, but he managed to pass over Dr. Carlson, and then Bush's brother, and then Marcos Rubio, and then all the candidates that were called to be the candidates. And then, of course, we have the election, and it seems that, Hillary was going to win sort of easily. That's what everybody was predicting. But it turned out that it wasn't the case, and this has been a really surprising turnout of the results. But as both of our speakers do believe, it's something that we can explain. And now we are going to try to help understanding what has happened. Let's try also to look forward what we can expect from the Trump administration. So in order to do that, we have to well-revere Harvard faculty. Here in my farther left, we have Tony Gómez-Ibáñez, which is there a Bock professor and has a double appointment, which is actually something really weird, exceptional, at the GSD, Graduate School of Design, and at the Kennedy School. Here we have Professor David Kennedy, which is the director of the IGLP and is professor of the law school. Both are distinguished members of the Real Colegio Complutense Academic Council, and they've been serving for many years, more than probably they want to recall or remember. And we also thank them here publicly for all these years of service at RCC. And the way we are going to proceed is that first they are going to have like a general overview to this issue from different perspectives. We've been thinking about what will be the most enriching for this Spanish audience. And from then onwards, we are going to address some questions. And finally, we are going to open the floor for Q&A, so be ready to ask whatever you feel or make comments. So without further ado, whoever wants to be first, Tony, go for it.
I think what I would like to talk about is why the Democrats lost, and particularly to point out that there are a lot of different explanations, all of which might be true.
Micro. Closer.
I want to talk about why the Democrats lost, and particularly distinguish between some explanations which lots of people accept and what I think is a fundamental disagreement within the Democratic Party about how to respond and what happened. One of the things that everybody accepts is that Hillary was at a very big disadvantage being in an environment where the citizenry wanted change. She was the...
Even closer.
Let's see if these were better.
Geez.
Don't need it. Now it's working.
In any case, in an environment where the voters wanted change, she was the status quo candidate to end all status quo candidates. And it's particularly puzzling why the voters wanted change after 8 years of Obama, who was going out with particularly high ratings. But nonetheless, they did, and she was not the candidate you would pick if you were running for change. think the second thing that everybody agrees on was that it was very unusual to have both candidates have such high undesirable ratings within the electorate, that they were, neither of them were trusted. And that led in part to the surprise. I mean, the Democrats in the summer were saying, thank God they were going to nominate Trump, because Trump's the only person that Hillary could beat. And I think the Republicans had some of the same reaction, right? That thank God they've nominated Hillary, given that we've nominated Trump, it's about the only person that we could win with as the opponent. But what it meant was that the election was a lot more volatile, given those high unfavorables. I think a third thing that everybody agrees on is that Hillary couldn't figure out how to respond to Trump's unorthodox campaign style. People differ as to whether how well her campaign was run, but most campaign people think it was the best of conventional wisdom. But how do you respond to someone who calls people names and insults them and makes outright lies and tweets in the middle of the night and so on? She never really figured out how to do it, and the only thing that she could do was to make an issue of his personality the center of the campaign, which of course brought up her personality as well. So she never really had a chance to respond. But I think that there are two explanations that are probably more important, and that the Democratic Party is trying to figure out what their relative importance is. And I think there's a split in the Democratic Party. And one of them is racism, right? To a great extent, many of us think that having a black president and a black family in the White House was more than some people in our society could take. And to have that be followed by a woman was also not very attractive. And the second explanation, this competing explanation, is the economic insecurity, the sense that some people were falling behind in the economy and that the income inequality was growing greater. Those two explanations are not very happy ones for the Democratic Party, in part because it's hard to figure out what to do with them, even if you were sure which was the right explanation. In the case of the racism and misogyny and so on, what do you really do? We've been trying for 50 years or more to reduce racism in society and to reduce misogyny. Can you shame the population into not being racist? It seems unlikely, and it seems like an attempt to shame them was part of the problem that led to their reaction, and may have actually intensified racism rather than solved it. And to the extent that you believe that it's the economy, or particularly the growing inequality and the fact that some people were left behind, that's also a little discouraging as well, because we don't have great remedies for that, aside from, say, more progressive taxation. You know, we don't do trade adjustment to retrain workers who've lost their jobs because of trade. And our education system is not really preparing people for the jobs of the 21st century, kind of post-manufacturing jobs. But the Democratic Party has to figure this out, has to figure out which of those two explanations is really important, or what mix of the two, and how to respond to it. And I think that's going to be the big challenge. This is the big reason why they lost, and the big challenge that they have to overcome.
So I thought I'd say something about sharing a great deal of Tony's analysis of why the Democrats lost and what they need to figure out. Say something about what to make of the election now. So there's no question that it was a very close election, extremely close. Everyone knows that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and if it had been a little bit different here or a little bit different there, it could easily have come out the other way. And that's led to a lot of people asking questions about this, that, or the other small thing that might have tipped the election in a different direction. And all those concerns are right, as in every election that's relatively close, it could have gone the other way, and we would be interpreting the future of a Hillary Clinton presidency. But it was also a decisive election, an extremely decisive election, institutionally and politically. And I think that's what we're having a hard time now understanding. So I think the first decisive aspect of the election is that the achievement of a Republican Party ascendancy across the government and in all levels and branches of government and in the majority of the state governments. So the Democratic Party has some work to do, but there are also plenty of time to do it because they're not in power in any of these places. But the second decisive aspect of the election was a repudiation in both parties of what had been understood to be the elites of those parties. On the Democratic side, a rejection of the Clinton and long-term legacy. And, you know, it's interesting, the number of Obama voters who also voted for Trump. And I think they voted for change then, they voted for change now. There was some sense in which there was an appetite for a rejection of what the party had traditionally been offering in both of those elections, different as the candidates actually seemed to be from some perspectives. And also a rejection of the Republican leadership. So it was one after another of the establishment Republicans, Bush, Romney, and so forth, who were eliminated by Trump's political sagacity and approach. So there's a decisive realignment in both parties and an opportunity to figure that out. The Democrats will have the chance to figure that out with a lot of time on their hands, but the Republicans have to start figuring it out right now. And so if we tried to look at what the election will mean, the first thing to say is that it's very hard to know, and that a big aspect of what's hard to know is that Mr. Trump is a very unpredictable person, and he's not spelled out a lot about what he would intend to do at all, other than be the symbol of this set of decisions against the elites and in favor of the Republican Party in general, even if not in any detail. So we don't have a policy program to guide us. We have to try to figure out what will happen by reflecting on the tensions that are going to need to be resolved. So one tension, I just draw attention to three, will be the conflict between Mr. Trump and his entourage, the people that he's brought with him, on the one hand, and the very large U.S. government, which he will now be running, along with all of the established interests who are part of the compromises that that government embodies. So it's not just bureaucratic resistance, it's also that the current regulatory arrangements, tax arrangements, and so forth are the result of protracted ongoing social conflicts over many, many years with real interests in the society. Changing them will not be easy because all those interests will continue to be interested in what they were interested in before. And so there's a real challenge to a person coming with an anti-establishment message and style into an establishment position. The second challenge, I'd say, is to figure out how the conflict between the governing coalition, within the governing coalition, between these forces of realignment, represented by Trump and by many now mavericks or wannabe mavericks who are part of the Republican Party in a variety of places, and the more established forces of the Republican Party with whom they'll have to govern. And that's a question that I think everyone in the Republican Party, particularly those in power, are trying to figure out. And people will respond to that in very individual ways based on their own home constituencies, if they're elected officials, their own imagination of whether Trump will still be someone you'd want to be associated with 2 years from now or 4 years from now. And I don't think anyone in the Republican Party knows the answer to those questions, and they're trying to figure that out. And so we'll have to see how that unfolds. And then I think the third conflict that will need to be negotiated by the Trump administration is what we might call the checks and balances conflict, even though there's a Republican ascendancy, and even if it's able to work out its internal differences, and even if the president is able to take control of the executive branch, there are all these other people in Washington and elsewhere who wake up every morning trying to screw them up. So Washington remains a city where half the people get up every morning to try to mess up the other half. So there is there is still a court system, there is still a congressional system, and at the federal level, there still are states, including a number of states who have very different political arrangements and very different senses for ambitious politicians about how to get ahead than is now possible at the national level, California being the obvious example, but not the only one. So I think we're likely to see a series of tensions playing out between whatever it is that emerges in the next few months as the policy initiatives of the Trump administration. I don't think there'll be a coherent plan. I think there'll be a few initiatives as those tensions are somehow navigated. Do I have one more minute? I'll say something about foreign policy. So mainly I don't do domestic policy, which I think is the main thing that Trump will be concerned about. I do international affairs and foreign policy. Let me say a little bit about that. I mean, I don't expect foreign affairs to be as central to his presidency as other aspects of it, partly because of his own, except to the extent that doing things symbolically in foreign affairs will be an important part of his domestic political activity. But one, I think, can still say a few things. At the level of personnel, there's no question that he's drawn on people whose reputation is more maverick and more forward-leaning in their style, both as to their relationship to military activity and to other kinds of national security activity, intelligence, and so forth. He's chosen people who, in their background, have been at odds with their own departments and with their own areas of specialty because they were more aggressive. On the other hand, he ran a campaign that was not forward-leaning in those ways, other than symbolically. And so he ran a campaign that was about the realignment of the United States away from an expansive global posture of hegemonic guarantee for the securities of a variety of different places. So that needs to be sorted out. I guess I think we could say in broad terms that the Trump administration's foreign policy approach will continue two long-term trends that you won't find surprising. One is the decline in the relative significance of American power, both economically and also militarily, as a result of the failures in the Middle East and the rise of China. And that's created a situation in which we can anticipate that everyone in the world who's interested in these matters will find that in situations where 40 years ago or even 20 years ago, one would have expected that a regional power bidding for authority would have had to contend with an American guaranteed stability. Those regional powers can now test those boundaries. We see that happening most distinctively in the Middle East, but I think what's going on between Russia and Europe is very similar. And what the whole story of China's realignment with Southeast Asia and so forth is similar in that respect. Trump didn't create those forces. They were part of the situation and have been for a long time, and that will continue. And I don't think that it would have been as possible as Hillary Clinton thought it was to hold those forces stable for another 4 or 8 years. Those things were happening. And the second thing that was happening is a general weariness in the United States about foreign military operations that either cost a lot of money or involve a lot of people. That's something that's been true since the Iraq war difficulties. It continues to be true. And the general sense that millions of Americans who have served in the wars of the last 10 years, 15 years, and their families, that those military campaigns were badly run, badly conceived, and ultimately unsuccessful, is a part of our political culture, mainly in the battleground states, that I think he was very careful to tap into. What he understood about the veterans is that they did not think the wars had been wise, and the wars in which they had served and often sacrificed. So I think that is an aspect that's likely to empower him in a variety of different ways. And then the last thing I would say, and then I'll stop, is there's no question that the general emergence in political culture in the North Atlantic democracies of a critique of globalization has now come also to the United States. So I put that in that way because it's not true that America has become protectionist. It would require a lot of work for the United States to change its legislative approach to tariffs and trade and so forth. There are a lot of interests who really like exporting, and there are a lot of who really have a stake in their markets in China and their product sources in China. So it's not obvious that that would change in terms of policy, but there's no question that the political argument that globalization has losers who have not been attended to is now available in every democracy in the North Atlantic, and we're all trying to figure out what to do about that. And it's not clear that there are policy tools to deal with it, and it's not clear what form it will take, but I think he is, and his general foreign policy will be shaped in part by that background idea. So I guess I'm left only with two worries, really. I think a lot of that is a reason for being optimistic about the institutional and political structure of the society as a whole. I think two reasons to be worried, given his personality and the situation of uncertainty that we can see in the lack of a particular policy direction to assess, would be an overreaction by others to Trump's style of engagement and mode of communication. That could create some real instability. And it could also create instability if there's an overreaction by Trump himself and his group to a provocation or an incident of one sort or another. So those seem to me to be the two dangers I would see, but I think to the extent we can keep level heads, this too will be metabolized.
Thank you for this nice introduction. Before we focus in what is going to happen from now onwards with the Trump administration, there's been like a consensus among the two of you in early conversation in what your introduction. Trump is here because he's an anti-establishment candidate. And Tony before on the record said that Hillary was probably the only candidate that could have lost against Trump. And it seems that the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, made it pretty well fighting Trump and actually giving credit that he was an anti-establishment candidate. And what could have done the Democratic Party better? Besides of having a better candidate, it would have been a different ticket. It's been the Obama administration that lost the track of what David has said, and I think this is an interesting thought that also Obama was an anti-establishment, or more anti-establishment by far candidate than Hillary Clinton. A Hillary Clinton that, by the way, was a by far better candidate 8 years ago. So what could have the Democratic Party done better during the 8 years, or at least during the campaign? It would have been another ticket. It would have been.
Boy, I think we have yet to figure that one out. I mean, how you respond to the strategy that Trump took. If I knew that, I would be a wealthy consultant. But David was really talking about the situation in foreign affairs. Let me say a little bit about the situation domestically. I think there are several reasons to be pessimistic about what's going to happen, and a couple of reasons to be optimistic may be too strong, but at least not completely pessimistic. One of the pessimistic reasons is Trump's personality, right? As David said, he's got a thin skin. He thinks he knows everything already. He doesn't have to have the daily briefing on security. He thinks that the rules don't apply to him, so he's not worried about conflict of interest. He's got a fragile ego, which means that he overreacts to things. And I don't think these flaws are as bad in David's bailiwick in foreign affairs, or as bad in my bailiwick in domestic affairs as they are in David's. But I think they're very difficult to deal with. I think the second and related, given his attention span is so short, right, he's going to rely heavily on appointments, on the people that he appoints. And there, I think in the foreign policy area, they're actually better appointments than in the domestic area. I see David's nodding in agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, in the domestic area, first of all, you have his chief of staff, who's a real right-winger and has a reputation of being a racist. And then you have him making appointments to the EPA, the new head of the EPA doesn't believe in climate change, or the new Secretary of Labor doesn't believe in the minimum wage, or the new Secretary of Energy is a man who campaigned when he was governor of Texas on abolishing the Energy Department, and so on. That his appointments really are going to shake things up in a fundamental way, and in agencies that many people care a lot about. I think the most important appointments probably are Supreme Court justices, where he's going to be able to make at least one appointment, and probably several in the next 4 years, given the age of some of our justices, and that's going to have a lasting impact on public policy. But reasons to be optimistic are a couple. One is that he's pragmatic, that he doesn't really have a strong ideological compass, and therefore, when he comes up against a roadblock, he may decide to go around it or change policy or whatever, rather than fight to the death for it. And second, as David said, in domestic policy as in foreign policy, he's going to discover that there's a lot of political support for the programs that he wants to eliminate and the policies he wants to oppose. And you know, the fact that Boeing and American farmers benefit from exports is going to dampen the enthusiasm in Congress for imposing import quotas, or rather, import tariffs. Or the Obama, the health care program, he's discovering that there are several features of that that are very popular. Or when he goes to do his tax cuts, it's going to be even more important. Those deep tax cuts, if they're not going to increase the deficit, are going to require really slashing programs which lots of Congress people support, and will force him, I think, to change his policies in many respects. David talked a little bit about checks and balances. I think one of the things that you have to recognize on checks and balances is that there's a check and balance within the parties themselves, in that the party discipline is not very strong in the United States. To become the candidate from the Republican Party in the state of Massachusetts, you don't get named by the Republican Party nationally. You run in a primary against other Republicans to represent your party, which means that Republicans from Massachusetts look more like Democrats from California than anything else. And so just because you have 52 senators who are nominally Republican doesn't mean that some of them aren't going to defect on important votes, and vice versa, that some of the Democratic senators are going to defect from their party when called on. And that means, and you saw this, by the way, in the Tea Party, right, how much trouble the Republican Party had controlling that faction of their own party. And that means that Trump may not be able to align the full force of the majorities that the Republicans have won in the House and in the Senate. Finally, I think you have to remember that there's the bureaucracy to deal with, and not many of the new Trump appointees are really familiar with how to do it. My guess is that they will undermine them wherever possible by leaking and doing things like that. So there's some reason to be optimistic on the domestic side. Right?
Tell them. You want to elaborate on this? Or?
No, you had the question, or where should we go?
So before we had in a conversation eventually for the Spanish audience, and David said that he has a really simple answer for that. Many people at this side of the Atlantic is basically saying or addressing the question, why is not a debate about constitutional reform? We have a candidate that won the popular vote. We have a system, the Electoral College, and we have a system of check and balances, but it turned out that we have a president that hasn't been the winner in turnout of electoral vote, and so there is not a debate in the United States, and of course from an American perspective and from a constitutional perspective it's quite understandable, but eventually for a European audience, your views on that, the easy answer will be welcome.
Well, so the president, as you may know, is not elected by the popular vote. The president is elected by a system that is based on representation for states. And there are two significant rules. One is that every state has a number of electors, and that number leads to an overrepresentation of small and rural states, just as in the Senate, a protection of small states against large states. And the second rule is that winners take all in the state contests, so that even if you get a very small majority in a state, you get all the electors if you get a big majority. Now, the reason it's not a discussion in the United States of the kind you would imagine is because no one thinks it's possible to change either of these rules. That's the main thing, because there's so many people invested in it, and so it's a non-starter to imagine that they would be changed. But you might also imagine there was not a completely implausible reason for each of those rules. So the reason for the winner-take-all rule is designed in part to prevent a supermajority in one state or region from swamping the rest of the country. So imagine that Hillary Clinton had won California by 80%. And there was not a winner-take-all rule in the other states, then the dominance in California would have dominated everybody else. And so one explanation of this winner-take-all rule is to prevent supermajorities in some regions, it was originally designed with the South in mind, from trumping, so to speak, the choices of the many other people in all of the various other states. And then the second rule, the idea that the small states are overrepresented, is of course a relic of a time in which it seemed logical that Wyoming and California would have the same number of senators. There's a certain amount of craziness there, but the craziness is more pronounced in the Senate than it is in the Electoral College's relationship to the presidency. And every system has some kind of structural balance to ensure the representation of different parts of the overall society. That's our particular thing. It is a very dramatic fact. So, and I'm now going to report a fact which might be true, which is the new kind of facts we have. So don't quote this as true, but I believe it's the case that 24 states or 48 senators make up only about 15% of the population, which means that if African Americans had the same preferable representation as rural states, they would have 48 senators. So of course there are very profound political questions in how you arrange these super representational things. That's the one we have and that we're stuck with. And I think the thing that's interesting about it is, despite that, if we look at the election, it was exceedingly close and might have gone the other way. So if you think, what was the cause of the defeat? There are many, many other causes, but it's not obvious that the most significant one is a wildly out of whack constitutional arrangement. The most significant one is a wildly out of whack political situation.
So, going with what the Trump administration is going to face, to start with the majorities that right now Trump has in the House, in the Senate, there's an overwhelming majority. We have 2 years for the midterm elections, so what can we expect? Is he going to put the agenda, or precisely because he's an anti-traditional candidate, an anti-establishment within the party candidate, and is appointing candidates that precisely are not following what we will consider the traditional Romney sort of candidate for those offices? What we can expect? Can we expect 2 years of a landslide, or?
So I guess I'll do foreign, he'll do domestic. So I think the first thing to say is Mr. Trump does not have a majority in both houses of Congress. There are a majority of members of both houses of Congress who are nominally Republican. And so that needs to be considered in a relationship to the considerations that Tony put on the table earlier. And so they were not elected on a well-agreed policy platform. These are the 5 things they're going to do. Certainly not all of them were elected on the same 5 things that they were going to do. So we can expect some initiatives of one sort or another to be now tested by different people in the different parts of the party to see whether that could be the thing that might get the attention of political energy to happen. In a government like ours, you can only do a few things in a year, only a few things in 4 years. So which will be those things is going to be struggled over in the next few months. In the foreign affairs field, I think we could imagine 3 kinds of things. One kind of thing would be very easy for the president to do on his own, of great symbolic significance. Why not do it? So the most obvious of those would be show more dramatic support for the state of Israel. Very easy to do. It's not politically controversial in any way that would be significant. Can be done by the president. He's already done it through the appointment of a new ambassador to Israel. So I think that's, in a way, a kind of very unsurprising move on his part. Another easy thing, a little bit more substantive perhaps, would be to declare the end to trade negotiations that were on their way to ending anyway. So the TPP didn't have a lot of legs under it anymore, and it now certainly doesn't, but it wouldn't have if Hillary Clinton had been elected either. Symbolically significant, easy for him to do on his own. He's stopping a negotiation that's underway rather than the one that's already been done. At the other end of the spectrum, we'd have things that would be very hard and substantive to change. One of those would be dramatically changing the balance of protectionist and non-protectionist measures in the American budget, tax system, and legislative arrangements. For all the reasons Tony said, it would be very difficult for him to do that. Changing the deal on Cuba. The trains left the station. There are a lot of commercial interests involved. There are a lot of American companies who feel they were already behind Canadian and European countries in their relationship with Cuba. It would be very hard for him to do anything substantive, even if he tries to do something symbolic. Changing the deal on Iran. That train has also left the station. The fact that the Europeans were not likely to go back on it, and that there are many, including Boeing, American interests with a strong, powerful interest in continuing the deal, makes it very unlikely that he would be able to turn that around without a lot more political work than he's likely to be willing to do. In the middle, I would say, are things which are neither as hard as that, nor as easy as appointing a different ambassador to Israel, and I'd put immigration in that bucket. It's no surprise that he made immigration, particularly Mexican and Latin American immigration, illegal immigration, the main story in many parts of his campaign. It will be very difficult for him to change the relative composition of the American electorate, which is becoming increasingly diverse and increasingly Hispanic in many places. And it would be very difficult for him to reduce the overall number or percentage of illegal workers in the American workforce. They're about 10% of the American workforce. There's something like 14 million of them in the United States. That's a very large number of people, and there are very many industries that depend upon their existence. Most of them do pay Social Security. The Social Security system depends upon the fact that they pay but don't get any benefits. So there's that you can't just deport 14 million people. Even if you started tomorrow, you'd have to hire 1,000 police officers a day. It would be an extremely difficult thing to do, and he's not going to do it. But you could do some things. You could end some particular kinds of visa programs. You could speed up the deportation of people who are not entitled to be in the country, have been convicted of a crime, and have not been deported. So the Obama administration deported 2 million of those people. There are an additional 3 million or so who've been identified. It wouldn't be surprising if the Trump administration, in a more public way, continued the deportation policies of the Obama administration. So that's a kind of in the middle kind of situation where he can do some things He certainly is not going to expand our openness as a society to immigrants, but it would be very difficult for him to do a great deal. And so I think that range, what is it he can do symbolically on his own? What is it that's really difficult because of the embedded interests and would take more political energy than he has? And what is it that's in the middle that he could do some symbolic things that would be significant but would run into an obstacle he might prefer not to push on if he tried to do more, is the way I understand what the likely scenario would be, at least in my own domain.
In domestic policy, he's promised to do so much so early that I think he's bound to be frustrated. I don't know whether you've been following, but he plans, the tax cuts are going to be early, $1 trillion infrastructure program. He's going to cut regulations. And of course, the signature thing that he would promise to do in the campaign was to eliminate Obamacare. And Obamacare is emblematic of what's problems he's going to face. In Obamacare, they actually don't know what to do, right? There are several provisions of Obamacare that are very popular with the people. One provision that you can't be disqualified from getting insurance because of pre-existing medical conditions. And another provision which says that your children can live on your policy until age 26. The Republicans have, and Trump in particular, has promised to preserve those two pieces of Obamacare, but they have no idea how to do it. So their answer, or the latest idea, is that they're going to repeal Obamacare immediately, which is what they promised to do, but effective a year or two from now, and spend a year or two from now deciding exactly how to replace it. This has driven the insurance industry and the hospital industry wild, right? The notion that they won't know what the rules of the game are for a very important piece of legislation for them for 2 years, or at least a year, is just a non-starter. The other areas are not, and it's not clear how you actually have a private insurance company system that takes care of people who have prior existing conditions, for example. So they don't know how to do it, even if they could do it. The tax cuts, I think, are going to be problematic unless they are not honest about what's going to happen to the deficit, because they're going to run into all kinds of popular programs that they're going to cut. The infrastructure program, the $1 trillion infrastructure program, they have not identified a revenue source for it. And the promise that they're going to reduce regulation comes up against other checks and balances. In order to change regulations, you have to go through a fairly elaborate procedure of notice of proposed rulemaking and comment period and et cetera, in the American system. So it's going to take him a long time to change regulations, even if he knows which ones to change. So my sense is that you won't see as massive a change, anywhere near as massive a change as he's promised, in part because they don't know how to effectuate some of these things, and in part because they're going to come up against the supporters of the programs they want to get rid of.
Going to a different but related and I think really important issue. When the former Speaker of the House, the conservative, during the Obama administration was overthrown, he was blaming the Tea Party that they sort of shared the view, but they wanted burning down the house, and there was another abuse of dealing with things, and the Democratic Party, the Republican Party was really divided. Can we say right now that, for what you remember, the American society is more divided than in decades? I mean, have you seen, at least I haven't seen demonstrations like the one we are seeing, the millennials, but also many intellectuals and the civil society that are, for instance, demonstrating peacefully against racism, against. So is this something that is going to pass as long as do, or is it trying to start doing that? David says, for instance, even the same things that the Obama administration was doing, that, for instance, deportation of illegal immigrants publicly. There's going to be a stronger social content. It's going to be sort of a liberal Tea Party coming.
Well, I think there's several questions in that group. The first is, will the current leadership of the Republican Party in Congress face the kind of primary challenges or belief that they'll face primary challenges of the sort that was faced by those Republicans during the Tea Party period? I think the answer is yes. They'll certainly fear that will happen, and that will be an important part of how they adjust their behavior. And they don't know what the source of the political energy that might be against them will be, or where it will come from, and whether it will be defined by Trump or in some other way, because he was so singular. He's not part of a Tea Party movement particularly. So I think that's an uncertainty in their calculation. Is the society more divided? I don't know how we would measure more or less. It's certainly a very divided society. In many ways, it's both residentially segregated by political commitment more and by relative wealth and by participation in the global economy than it has been in a long time. So you find, this very similar to Brexit, that the regions were quite different in their relationship to the culture and economy of globalization. And people live with people who agree with them and around people who agree with them. And in that sense, there are more cultural divisions. There's some reasons for optimism there. I think that's one of the reasons that the federalism structure might take on a different kind of life. You could expect to find a different kind of healthcare system in California or elsewhere 5 years from now than the one that you have at the national level, as you had in Massachusetts, a different healthcare system that in some way led the way to the development of the Obamacare regime. So the division is not always a national division. To the extent it's a regional or local division, you might find cities taking a different kind of political attitude about things. And then the last thing I'd say is the resistance from the Democratic Party and civil society. Yes, I think there will be and continues to be resistance there. I think these internal conflicts within the both institutional structure and political structure at the establishment level are more significant. But there's no question that the traditional institutions, non-governmental institutions, the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Organization of Women, and so forth, have been very vocal in positioning themselves in the last month as an important branch of the resistance to the Trump agenda. Bob Reich, who is Secretary of Labor, has a blog that comes out every day called The Resistance, and you can tune in and get a channel of The Resistance, which he started a month or so ago, trying to give expression to what civil society can do and ought to do. A lot of that resistance will take its form through the court system and through the local political regimes that are available in states. So I think we will anticipate finding a lot of legal resistance that gives expression to social movements. And the fact that Mr. Trump will appoint at least one, if not more, members of the Supreme Court will blunt that but not eliminate it. Obama has appointed a very large number of federal judges. Democrats have appointed or found elected a very large number of state court judges. So the legal system remains an important vehicle for the expression of social energy when it gets mobilized in some way. So yes, I think we'll continue to see that.
I think one of the big questions is how polarized American society is, and whether we've actually just uncovered the polarization that existed long ago for a long time, or whether this is new. My hope is that it's in part at least new, and that Trump has made expressions of polarization more acceptable than it was before, but that the level of polarization is not appreciably different than it was in the past, and that we can get along. That being said, it's amazing how depressed the Democrats are and how jubilant many of the Republicans are. The intensity of feeling about this race was very strong, and it'll take a while to recover from that, I think.
We are happy, as I said, to open the floor whenever I see a hand. So if I don't see a hand, so we have two here. But before that, just in case they don't ask about it, while elaborating, I would like to have a word about what I think is a key issue to understand what has happened and what is happening in Europe. So inequality, and beyond inequality in the figures, those who fell left behind. Can you say a word about that eventually explain what happened with the Bernie Sanders campaign, and also eventually some of the of the feds and the support for Trump before we go to this?
Maybe just I would say very quickly, but you might have a better sense of this, Tony. I think there are two issues in the inequality issue. One is the real decline and experienced decline of wages in the middle class of the United States across the board, under conditions of globalization. And that creates a set of experiences that they're not part of whatever it is that's moving in the society, even though the economy is in pretty good shape. But there's another dimension to it, which is the cultural dimension that I think is in many ways more significant and we may have missed, which is the general experience that people who are losers in globalization have of being losers, that is, of being shamed in one or another way by the mainstream culture for not having gotten a startup going in San Francisco, or simply for being the wrong kind of person or having the wrong kind of attitudes, or you mentioned shaming people out of their racism. We've tried to, as an establishment, shame people out of a lot of feelings that they really do have. And we've given them the experience that they're the wrong kind of people in the wrong kind of place and that somehow they don't belong. And so I think the reaction that we're getting is a reaction of, yes, we do, we're here, we exist, and we do matter, and we're not ashamed of who we are in some way. And so I think that the distribution of honor and shame is in many ways as important politically as the distribution of real material resources. And as a society, we have not attended enough to either, and they're both at work here.
I agree with David.
So actually, they say in your school, they always say, we open the floor and a question ends with a question mark. So. You have a mic there.
Thank you. I haven't read your, it's a question for Professor Kennedy. I haven't read your recent book. I very much look forward to it. However,
yes, an advertisement.
There's also, however, how do you read the Brexit and in particular the Trump victory in relation to the role of experts? Because we have seen voters using the vote for change, but also against experts. I don't know to what extent that was the case in the United States, but very clearly we heard in the UK people saying people in this country have had enough of experts and being lectured about what's good and bad, and Trump won against the advice and against the endorsement of all major newspapers and against the endorsement of the intellectual establishment in the United States. So where does that put the role of expertise in the public debate? Are they having it wrong? Is that a sort of popular reaction, destruction of that type of hegemonies? But again, maybe my question could be improved after I read your book. Thank you very much.
So I just wrote a book about expertise. That's what he's referring to. I think, let's use another word, managerialism, technocracy, the sense that our societies are governed by procedures and people who have specialized knowledge of some kind or other, and that it's very difficult to contest in any meaningful way the outcomes of those if you're a regular guy. I think if the problem were, what do we do about scientific expertise versus political knowledge? Do we have too much science, not enough politics? So we believe the science is too much about global warming or not enough or whatever. We could find an institutional solution to get the best of technical knowledge and get the best of political decision. I think the real trauma in North Atlantic democracies, but particularly I think the UK and the US, which I know better than others in Europe, is that we don't have either believable technical knowledge or clear political vocabularies for aggregating interests and acting in the public interest. So in some way they've mushed into each other. So all of the political figures are talking in vaguely vulgar expert ways about something, not taking responsibility but imagining that something about what they know requires them to act, so that nobody's really able to contest it. But the experts are completely divided by ideological position and nobody believes them. Every time you see an expert on TV, they have a counter-expert. So that the real problem is the loss of both expertise and political life into one another, not the idea that there's too much expertise. And I think that's a problem that we haven't come to terms with. It has something to do with globalization, in that these loose forms of discussion and management spread very easily. Vocabularies of principle and counter-principle and so forth spread across boundaries. And once you go to Brussels, you start talking more responsibly and decisively, but less politically and also less scientifically. It's a whole specialized vocabulary that is easily communicated among the elites at that level. Well, we have that in our national society too. So I think that's a very significant part of our political problem. We don't know how to be outside that. And that means that consolidation of political and expert technocratic knowledge leaves only bad alternatives on the outside. Religious extremism, terrorism, of course, for sure, but also racism, nationalism. There's no way to say I'm outside that without breaking some taboo. And I think, or let's have Brexit. So there's no way to oppose it other than to try to just disestablish it. And that's not an option that's going to turn out to lead to a solution to any of the problems that many people want to do it. But what else are they supposed to do? So I think that no exit quality of our contemporary way of discussing political decisions is a big part of what, in a longer term, all of our societies are going to have to come to terms with. Your question's for Tony.
My name is Pedro Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor here in the International Relations Department at Complutense. Thank you for this conversation, first of all. And I think we have beaten a world record because we have spent 1 hour talking about the next Trump administration without mentioning Russia or Putin. And I would like, please, if you can share your thoughts, your pessimistic views or optimistic views about this topic. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a question for Tony in the sense that, how significant ought we to imagine the charge that there was in one or another way tampering with the U.S. election by Putin? So that's a question of domestic political life, and I'll leave that to him to respond to. I think in terms of the position of regional powers challenging the current arrangements, Russia would be one of them. And it's not surprising that Russia would be challenging the current arrangements after having had to retreat so powerfully from a global position after 1989 through all of the 90s. It's not at all surprising, whether it was Putin or somebody else, that Russia would be back at the table. And so how those are dealt with and what they mean, and the idea that the United States is not going to guarantee that the current status quo be maintained everywhere anymore, I think that would have been true even if Trump had not been elected. Now, does Trump fantasize that he's going to be able to come to a deal with Putin like he did with whoever it was that he built the casino in New Jersey with? He probably does. He's a person who's used to understanding himself, dealing with other powerful maverick individuals and being able to best them at their own game one after the other. We'll see what happens. My own sense is that the challenges that Russia has made to the global arrangements have been not unexpected and are not particularly destabilizing necessarily, although my Ukrainian friends would be very angry with me for saying that. But the realignment of European powers in a relationship to Russia that's more engaged, the re-emergence of Russia as a player with a significant interest in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, where they have a long-term history, is not surprising. And it's in some ways you have to ask the question, of all the regional powers who might move into the vacuum, let's say in the Middle East, created by the American withdrawal of energy and attention and so forth, I wouldn't put Russia at the bottom of the list of those that I would like to see there. And so I think there were many people within the U.S. military and security establishment, let's say on Syria, who already 2 years ago were saying that in Syria we should turn this over to the Russians. So that's not a Trump idea. That's an idea that one heard in a variety of places because there simply was no energy and there was no clear path to turning it over to the Americans. That wasn't going to happen. So who are you going to turn it over to? No, they're not only bad choices there. And so I guess from that point of view, I don't think the question of personalities, which the media has focused on, is going to be as significant as the longer-term realignment of interests between regional powers generally, like Russia, global powers like China, and the United States as we adjust to a situation in which the U.S. will remain a significant, if not the most significant, military as well as economic player, but not predominant, and neither desiring nor able to dictate the arrangements outside of our own region.
My little corner of that question. I think one of the things that's interesting in my list of why the Democrats lost, and in lots of other people's lists of why the Democrats lost, does not appear the Putin leaked emails, and nor does it include Jim Cooney, the FBI director, who about 10 days before the election said they'd found some trove of Hillary Clinton's emails, and then a few days later had to say that there was nothing new in them. I mean, there was a steady drip of unflattering news that reminded people of Trump's assertion that Hillary was a crook and not to be trusted with national security. But I think for most of us, we're reluctant to say that could have been decisive, and in part not because we really know, which we don't. We don't know how important it was. But in part, just a pragmatic recognition that there's nothing we could do about it. Right? There's no real way to change an election, to run an election over again. We have no system for saying this election was manipulated and should be redone, unless the evidence were much more egregious and obvious. Right? It's just been ignored.
Can I just say one other thing about the cyber war thing? So why are we so ham-handed in responding? The reason is there's no good way of responding. And there are two reasons for that. And this has to do with efforts to create a legal platform for cyber war. The reason it's very difficult to do that is because all of the major powers engage in nonstop cyber engagement with everybody else under the general domain of espionage. And there's no way cleanly to distinguish the routine everyday espionage that goes on through those cyber channels from things that might be understood to be acts of war, acts of aggression. If we could draw that distinction, there might be some way of trying to manage it. But the fact that everybody's engaged in that and sees it as a privileged sovereign activity needs to be taken into account. The second thing is, we're in all of their systems, they're in all our systems. There's a lot that people understand about that, but the U.S. is an extremely vulnerable society to cyber attack of a variety of kinds because we're so dependent on a variety of different systems, and our systems are so disintegrated. It's a large country with all kinds of different systems. A lot of people manage them, so the controls are very hard to harden. A lot of them are in the hands of private powers that are very difficult to regulate. And so it's extremely difficult for us to harden our society against penetration and against any kind of... So that means if you can't present the president with a mode of responding, which if made public, so that the other side felt that they then needed to respond for their own dignity, wouldn't do us more damage. That's a very real problem. And I think what we've hoped to see is only just a kind of pulling back of everybody from the brink of that, rather than any effort of tit for tat. It just doesn't, the deterrence model of nuclear weapons doesn't apply here, because it's not something that's used once with a button. It's something that's ongoing all the time in deeply interpenetrated systems.
So I see that you disagree with Trump's suggestion that eventually it was a fat guy sitting in an armchair in the Midwest state, right? Like we said in the debate. So we have the last question, and this is the last one, and it's your turn.
Probably this result was much more predictable than it seems, or so you are accepting. This is saying that the devil's best trick is to make us believe that he doesn't exist. And I think that for example, people are very much surprised with corruption in politics. And if you think about it, many times it's an unavoidable effect of the way things are being done. And what I would like to ask you is, it has to do with how you expect the academia in the United States and in the world will react to the present situation, where it seems that negative emotions are much more powerful than any kind of rationality, and that rationality has drawn back and has accepted a very passive or a very, comfortable role in society. So it arrived to me a letter from the director of the Harvard Medical School that made me a strong impression, because it was a letter that called almost for a minutes of war because of the fact that Trump has been elected. Would you expect that the American academic would react and try to impose some rationality into politics today, or would you think that is too much of a 60s way of, or nostalgic of the 60s way of looking at the university in the United States? That's my question.
Do you have a good answer?
You going to answer?
Do you want to think of it? Or do you want to?
I'll think of it.
Okay. So he's going to think, and I'm just going to talk. That's our normal. That's our normal pattern. So, one, universities are doing a lot of things. Some of them sensible, some of them less sensible. I think, and are responding both institutionally, setting themselves up as sanctuaries for students who are illegally in the United States but are studying there and not being part of the apparatus of their deportation and so on. And certainly messaging to their students about how to think about it. And there are a lot of these messages coming out of leaders of university institutions about how to think about what the community is and how the community ought to engage. I'm not sure how effective those are, either inside the university or outside the university, but people feel they need to do it. The thing that's interesting to me is the role that universities have played in the culture which is now under challenge. So I wouldn't say it's reason against passion. Everybody thinks their own thing is reasoned and the other guy's thing is passion. I mean, that's certainly my view of my own position. It's very reasonable. And I don't know why those other people are so passionate. But that idea that we have reason and they have craziness is one of the things that they have rejected. Yeah. And the role that universities have played in participating in the culture of shaming other people for being passionate rather than engaging in civilized reasoned debate is, I think, has been our mistake too. So I think we need to figure out how to reconnect across lines of different modes of reason and different modes of passion to get something going. And universities ought to be able to play a role in that. We're not particularly well staffed for it. Both because a lot of us don't understand that very well, and we don't have a broad representation in many universities of the range of social forces that have been part of what's going on. But I think, yes, we have a role to play there. Whether we're now doing it or whether we know how to do it, there I am a bit more doubtful. Was that enough time for you to?
Thank God. Let me just say that I think there's a danger that the universities over-respond. That they become the bastions of political correctness, the critics of the majority that voted for, or near majority that voted for Trump. And you see that at Harvard. I mean, the letters from department chairmen or deans that are bending over backwards, acknowledging the pain that the losing side feels. And I think in universities like Harvard, the representatives of the other faction feel very much ostracized and under siege. I think that is the exact opposite of what we need to do. I mean, if we really want to not be so polarized and work on these differences, right? It's more likely to increase racism and many other problems than to reduce it if we make the universities the kind of moral arbiters in this case and side too openly with one side rather than another. There was in my own Kennedy school, there's a tradition at the end of every presidential campaign that the campaign managers get together for a discussion of what they did right and what they did wrong, candidly, in front of a small audience in the Kennedy School. Well, the students went crazy that the Trump campaign staff was going to be there, right, and demonstrated. I think, luckily, the university didn't listen to the students. But you have to be careful, right? Had they done so, it would have been another step backwards, and I think another step towards the polarization that David has been describing, and the shaming. So I think the universities have a role to play, but it's not necessarily the role they're inclined to play, given the mix of people that they have, and they have to be very careful.
All right, thank you, Tony. It's been like the fifth meeting or event on a roll that I have with Tony from this morning, the fourth with David. Mm-hmm. So for those our Complutense colleagues, students and faculty that didn't apply to the Real Colegio scholarship, this is the kind of faculty you have there. So we encourage you to take advantage of this possibility that you do have. I also thank some of the fellows I see here from the School of Public Health, Roman Languages, and the Kennedy School, and the Law School too. And our members, faculty from the Academic Council, and last but not least, to the organizers, Encuentros Complutense, and the Vice Provost for Research and International Relations, and their offices for working hard, and our rector for joining us. And last but not least, please join me thanking David and Tony, Professor Kennedy, and Professor Gómez-Ibáñez for their insightful thoughts and friendship. We have to do this back in Cambridge. Now that you already have to do this back in Cambridge.